The voicemail sat on my phone for 3 days before I finally deleted it, not because it hurt too much to listen to, but because by the time I thought about it again, I was standing on the deck of a cruise ship somewhere off the coast of Belize, watching the sun melt into the water like a slow amber yolk, and I realized I simply didn't need to hear it anymore. But let me back up, because the story doesn't start with the voicemail. It starts the way most painful things do, with love. With me thinking love was enough to protect me. My name is Lorraine. I'm 67 years old, retired after 31 years of teaching middle school history in Savannah, Georgia. I have a small house on Habersham Street with a magnolia tree in the front yard that I planted the year my husband, Gerald, passed. That was 11 years ago. I've lived alone since. I don't say that for sympathy. I say it so you understand what kind of quiet my days were made of and how much I poured into the people I loved because of it. I have one son. His name is Donovan. He's 41, works in logistics, and he married a woman named Tessa 6 years ago. She's from Connecticut. Very put together. Always smelled like something expensive. She called me Miss Lorraine the first 2 years, then stopped calling me much of anything after that. I want to be fair. Tessa wasn't cruel. Not openly. She was the kind of person who made you feel like you were slightly too loud, slightly too much, like you'd tracked mud onto a carpet that had just been cleaned. I noticed it. I chose to overlook it. Because Donovan seemed happy, and after Gerald died, Donovan's happiness was something I held onto like a rope. They have 2 children. My grandchildren. Aiden, who's 8, and a little girl named Cleo, who just turned 5. I drove to Atlanta, where they live, at least once a month. I brought peach preserves, dollar store crafts for the kids, and whatever I'd been baking that week. I was not a burden. I checked. I always called first. I always offered to help. I folded laundry. I picked up Aiden from school when they needed me to. I read Cleo to sleep with a different voice for every character. I was there. What I didn't realize was that being there doesn't always protect you from being left out. About 2 years ago, I started putting money aside in an envelope. Old habit. Gerald used to do it, actual cash in an actual envelope in the kitchen drawer, labeled in his handwriting. After he passed, I kept doing it, just to feel close to him somehow. I'd put in $40 a week. Sometimes $60 when I got a little extra from substitute teaching or selling my quilts at the craft fair on Broughton Street. By last spring, I had just over $9,000 in that envelope. I'd been thinking about doing something with it for a while. And then Donovan called, it must have been March, and mentioned, almost in passing, that he and Tessa had always wanted to take the kids on a big family vacation. Something special, maybe a cruise. I said, well, let me look into it. He laughed, the easy way he used to laugh when he was a boy. Mama, you don't have to do that. But I wanted to. I want you to understand that. Nobody twisted my arm. I sat at my kitchen table with my reading glasses and my laptop, and I spent 3 weekends researching cruise lines, comparing itineraries, reading reviews about which ships were good for kids, Aiden and Cleo's ages. I found a 7-night Western Caribbean cruise out of Port Canaveral. Norwegian, 4 cabins, 1 for me, 1 for Donovan and Tessa, 1 for the kids, 1 for my sister-in-law Louise, who I'd promised to bring along because she'd never been on a boat in her 70 years of living, and I thought it was time. I called Donovan when I'd figured it out. I told him what I'd found, what the dates were, what it would cost. He went quiet for a second, then said, Mama, are you serious? I was serious. I booked it in April. I put the deposit on my card and I paid the balance when it came due, 3 weeks later. $8,400, all in. Flights to Orlando for everyone. Ground transportation. I even bought the kids matching luggage, little hard-shell suitcases, red for Aiden, purple for Cleo. I wrapped them up and brought them to Atlanta on a Sunday afternoon so the kids could get excited. Aiden dragged his around the living room for 20 minutes making boat noises. Cleo put her stuffed elephant inside and said she was packing. Tessa smiled at me over Cleo's head. Miss Lorraine, this is too much. It's not too much, I said. This is what I saved it for. I believed that. I believed it completely. The cruise was scheduled for the second week of September. School would be back in session. The kids would have to miss a few days. Donovan and Tessa had said that was fine. I'd already printed the boarding documents, put together a folder with everyone's information, made a list of things to pack. I had bought myself a new swimsuit for the first time in probably 12 years. Navy blue, modest, with a little skirt at the bottom. Gerald would have said I looked like a young woman. I stood in the bathroom mirror and smiled at myself, which is something I don't do often enough. The text came on a Thursday evening in August. I was in the kitchen making a pot of Brunswick stew, the real kind, with whatever's left in the freezer and enough time to let it go low and slow. My phone lit up on the counter. It was from Donovan. I'll tell you what it said, not because I want to make you angry, but because I think you deserve to know the truth of it. Hey, Mama. I need to talk to you about the trip. Tessa has been feeling like the vacation won't really be a chance for our family to connect if it's a bigger group. She wants it to be just us, me, her, and the kids. I know this is hard, and I'm sorry. I hope you understand. You've already done so much, and we really appreciate everything. We'll figure out a way to pay you back for what you spent. I read it twice. Then I set the phone face down on the counter and stood there with my wooden spoon still in my hand, the stew bubbling quietly behind me. And I thought, when did I become a guest in my own generosity? I didn't cry. Not right away. I turned the burner down, went to the living room, and sat in Gerald's old chair, the green one I keep meaning to reupholster but never do. And I stayed there until the light outside went gray. There were so many things I could have said. I thought of all of them. I could have called Donovan and asked him to explain it to me like I was a person with feelings. I could have asked him calmly when exactly his wife decided that the woman who paid for the whole thing wasn't welcome on it. I could have pointed out that my name was on every booking confirmation sitting in a folder on my kitchen counter. Instead, I went back to the kitchen, ladled myself a bowl of stew, and made exactly one decision. I was going to think about this clearly, and then I was going to act. I didn't respond to the text that night. I didn't respond the next day either. Donovan called on Friday, and I let it go to voicemail. He called again Saturday morning. I was at my neighbor Paulette's house having coffee, and I looked at the screen, and I let it ring. Paulette is 72, sharp as a tack, and has no patience for foolishness of any kind. I told her what happened. She put her mug down slowly, the way she does when something has genuinely surprised her. He texted you, she said. Not a question. He texted me. She looked out her window at her azalea bushes for a long moment. Then she said, Lorraine, what are you going to do? I told her I wasn't sure yet, but something was forming. A quiet, clear thing like a photograph developing in a dark room. I could just make out the edges of it. I drove home that afternoon and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop again, the same table where I'd done all that research in the spring. I pulled up the Norwegian cruise website. I pulled up the airline confirmation. I pulled up the hotel reservation in Orlando for the night before embarkation. And one by one, I started making changes. The process took about 2 hours. There were hold times, a few transfers, one representative who put me on hold for 11 minutes. I counted. Every account was in my name. Every booking. Gerald used to say I was meticulous to the point of being annoying. I told him it was called being prepared. Sitting there that Saturday, I was grateful for every detail. I canceled Donovan and Tessa's cabin. I canceled their flights. I called the airline and had Aiden and Cleo's tickets voided too, since they were minors on my account. I moved Louise into a bigger cabin, an ocean view, an upgrade I hadn't originally splurged on. And then I called 2 women I'd known since Donovan was in diapers, my old teaching colleague Yvette, who'd retired to Hilton Head, and my cousin Marlette, who'd been talking about going somewhere warm since before the pandemic. I told them I had a cruise booked for September, good cabin, already paid for, and I wanted them to come. Yvette said, "Is this real?" I said, "Do I sound like I'm joking?" She said she'd have to check her calendar. I said, "Yvette, I am 67 years old. I paid for a cruise that I am now attending without the people I planned it for. I need an answer by tomorrow morning." She said yes. Merlette cried a little. She said she hadn't been on a vacation since 2019. I told her to start packing. Then I wrote Donovan a letter. Not a text. A letter, by hand, on the good stationery I keep in the hall closet. Gerald gave it to me years ago. Cream-colored, with a small embossed flower in the corner. I wrote it over 2 drafts. The first draft had things in it I'm glad I didn't send. The second draft said what I actually meant. I told him I had received his message and I had taken time to think about it. I told him I understood that he and Tessa had their own vision for the trip and that I respected a family's right to set the terms of their own vacation. I told him I had made some adjustments to the bookings since everything was in my name and that he and Tessa would be receiving cancellation notifications by email for their reservations. I told him I wished them well on whatever plans they made for themselves this fall. And at the end, I wrote this. I love you, Donovan, the way I have always loved you, without conditions. But I am learning at 67 that love without limits is not a virtue. It is an invitation. I am no longer extending that invitation to people who do not know its value. I hope that changes one day. I truly do. I sealed it, stamped it, and walked it to the mailbox myself. He called 4 times the following week. The first call I didn't answer. The second call I didn't answer. The third time he left a voicemail that started with, "Mama, what did you do?" And I didn't listen past that. The fourth time I picked up, he was upset. His voice was tight in that way it used to get when he was a teenager, trying not to raise his voice at me. He said he and Tessa were shocked. He said they'd been planning to book their own flights. He said he thought I was going to just take some money off the top for the canceled booking, and he didn't realize I was going to cancel everything. I let him finish. Then I said, "Donovan, you sent me a text message telling me I was no longer welcome on the trip I planned and paid for. What exactly did you think I was going to do?" Silence. I said, "I'm not angry with you, but I need you to understand that what you and Tessa decided had consequences. I did not ask you to pay me back. I asked for a seat at the table. When that was taken away, I made other arrangements. That's all." He said Tessa was really upset. I said, "I imagine she is." He said they might not be able to afford a vacation now. I said, "I'm sorry to hear that." And I meant it in the way you can mean something and still not change what you did. He asked if we could talk more when things settled down. I said, "Of course, you know where to find me." We hung up. I stood in the kitchen for a minute. Then I went back to packing my suitcase. We flew out of Savannah on a Friday morning. Me, Louise, Yvette, and Marlette. Louise had never flown before either, and she gripped the armrest on takeoff with her eyes squeezed shut, lips moving like she was praying. I held her hand. When we leveled off and she opened her eyes and saw the clouds below us, she said, "Oh, Lorraine, would you look at that?" I looked. We boarded the ship on Saturday. I remember walking up the gangway with my bag over my shoulder and the smell of salt water coming off the harbor and thinking, I did this. I saved for this. And here I am. Our cabin was lovely. Ocean view, just like I'd upgraded to. There was a small balcony with 2 chairs. And that first night, I sat out there while the ship moved away from port, watching the city lights shrink and the water darken around us, and I let myself feel everything I'd been holding at a careful distance for weeks. I felt the hurt of it. Of course I did. I'm his mother. There's no version of this story where that doesn't sting. I thought about Aiden's red suitcase still sitting somewhere in Donovan's apartment. I thought about Cleo's stuffed elephant and whether she'd asked why Nana wasn't coming. I thought about the folder on my counter with the boarding documents I put together so carefully. And then I thought about Gerald. About a trip we took early in our marriage, just a long weekend in the Smoky Mountains, nothing fancy, barely enough money for the cabin rental. He got a terrible sunburn the first afternoon because he refused to wear sunscreen and thought Georgia sun was somehow different from Tennessee sun. He wore a bedsheet around his shoulders for the rest of the trip because the fabric of his shirts hurt. He looked completely ridiculous. He was completely happy. I thought, I want to be completely happy. The next 7 days gave me that. We went to Cozumel and Marlette and I took a cooking class where we made shrimp tacos and a mango salsa that I'm still thinking about. Louise had her first margarita on a beach in Rotan and declared it the best thing she'd ever put in her body. Yvette, who I'd always known as quiet and careful, turned out to be an absolutely relentless shuffleboard competitor and beat 3 different strangers over the course of the week without showing a single ounce of mercy. At night, we had dinner together at a different restaurant on the ship each time. There were 8 to choose from, and we talked the way women talk when they feel safe. About our husbands, the ones we'd lost and the ones we'd left and the ones we were still figuring out. About our children. About the specific grief of loving someone who doesn't quite know how to receive it. About what it costs to be the one who gives. One night, after Marlette had gone to bed early and Louise had fallen asleep in her chair on the cabin balcony with a novel open in her lap, Yvette and I sat in one of the ship's lounges with drinks we didn't finish and talked until almost midnight. She told me about her own son, who'd moved across the country and called her twice a year. She said she'd spent a long time trying to be smaller so he wouldn't feel guilty. Then she stopped. She said, "I don't know what changed. I just got tired of being less so someone else could feel comfortable." I told her I understood that better than I ever had before. She said, "You know what the worst part is? They don't even notice when you make yourself small. You do it for them and they don't even see it." I thought about that for a long time after. The last morning, I got up before the others and went out on the balcony with my coffee. We were coming back into Port Canaveral. You could see the Florida coast in the early morning light, flat and green and very still. Pelicans flying low over the water in a line, one after the other, like they knew exactly where they were going. I have a granddaughter named Cleo who is 5 years old and who laughs like a hiccup that she can't stop. And I love her more than I know how to say. I have a grandson named Aiden who once asked me if clouds were made of sky, and then got very serious when I tried to explain about water vapor, like it was extremely important that he understand this correctly. I love him too, in the specific, unfair way that you love children. Completely, without any expectation that they understand the depth of it. I am not cutting anyone off. I want to be clear about that. I am not the kind of woman who throws people away. But I am 67 years old. I have 31 years of showing up for other people. I have $9,000 I saved in an envelope, $40 at a time, because Gerald used to do it and I wanted to feel close to him. I used most of it on something that ended up being exactly right, just not the way I originally planned. Donovan called again the week I got home. We talked for almost an hour, which is longer than we talked in years. He did not apologize for Tess's decision. He apologized for the text. He said he should have called. He said he should have talked to me like I was his mother and not a problem to be managed. I said, yes, that's right, you should have. We're not all the way back to where we were. I don't know if we will be. But I'm not sitting in Gerald's green chair waiting for it either. I signed up for another cruise in the spring. Alaska this time. Yvette says she's in. Louise says she'll pray about it, which from Louise means yes. I went back to the craft fair on Broughton Street last weekend and sold 4 quilts. I stopped at the florist on the way home and bought myself a bunch of sunflowers for no reason at all. The tall ones, the kind that look almost too cheerful to be real. I'd put them in the blue pitcher on the kitchen counter, the one Gerald picked out because he said it matched my eyes. Which was a ridiculous thing to say since my eyes are brown, but he was that kind of man. I stood there looking at them for a moment before I put my bag down. Then I put the kettle on, and I started planning the next thing. I used to think that giving without keeping score was the purest form of love, and maybe it still is, but I've learned the hard way, at 67, standing on a cruise ship balcony with a cup of coffee going cold in my hands, that generosity without self-respect isn't noble. It's just slow disappearing. When Donovan sent that text, something shifted in me that I don't think will shift back. Not because I stopped loving him. I didn't. I don't. But I finally saw clearly what I'd been doing for years, making myself smaller and smaller so that everyone else could feel comfortable in the space I'd already paid for. With money. With time. with the particular grief of a woman who buried her husband and decided the best way to survive it was to pour herself into other people. That's not a virtue. That's a habit dressed up as one. What I did next: canceling those bookings, calling Louise and Yvette and Marlette, writing that letter on Gerald's cream-colored stationery. None of it came from anger. That surprised me. I'd expected to feel rage, the hot kind that makes you say things you regret. Instead, I felt something quieter, a kind of clarity, like a window that had been fogged over for years finally going clean. I think that's what happens when you act from your actual values instead of your fear. Fear would have had me call Donovan back immediately, apologize for being difficult, offer to send him money anyway, find some way to make the whole thing easier for everyone except myself. I had done that before, more times than I want to count. But I'd spent 31 years teaching children that character isn't what you say about yourself, it's what you do when something costs you. And what this cost me was real. $9,000, a vision I'd carried for 2 years. The image of my grandchildren dragging little red and purple suitcases up a gangway. I gave that up, and I chose something else. Not revenge, not punishment, just accountability. Mine for what I would and would not accept, and his for what he had chosen to do. I think about the women at that dinner table on the ship, the last night, Louise and Yvette and Marlette, all of us past 60, all of us with our histories and our losses, and the specific wisdom you only get from having lived long enough to make the same mistake several times before you stop. There's a kind of intelligence that doesn't come from being young or being certain. It comes from paying attention to patterns, to what drains you, to the difference between someone who values your presence and someone who values your function. I had been someone's function for a long time. I'm done with that. I'm not finished with my son. I don't believe in throwing people away, and I don't think he is a bad man. I think he is a man who took the path of least resistance one too many times and didn't understand what it would cost either of us. That has consequences. Not punishment from the universe, not karma in any mystical sense. Just the plain, ordinary consequence of choices catching up with you. His caught up with him. Mine, the old ones, caught up with me too. What I know now is this: the trip I took, the one I actually went on, was the right one. Not in spite of what happened, but because of it. I sat on that balcony and watched pelicans fly in a straight line over flat Florida water, and I thought, I am still here. I am still capable of joy. And I am never again going to cancel my own seat at a table I built. That's the thing nobody tells you about getting older. You stop waiting for permission to matter. I bought sunflowers on the way home. I put the kettle on. I started planning the next thing.